"I've never done this." Her words changed everything that night. The millionaire promised to go slow and turned her vulnerability into the most delicate moment of their lives. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what happened next will surprise you. The silence of the penthouse was broken only by the distant sound of jazz drifting from some club in the French Quarter below, but inside Ilara's chest, a storm was forming. Her hands trembled as she held the champagne flute that Callum had offered moments before. The panoramic view of New Orleans, illuminated, seemed unreal, like everything that had happened in the last 6 hours. The golden lights of the Crescent City connection reflected on the Mississippi River, creating a path of light that stretched to infinity, and she felt equally infinite in that sea of possibilities. There was something poetic and terrifying about being there, in that space that smelled of aged leather and freshly ground coffee, surrounded by a luxury that contrasted violently with the small apartment in the Garden District where she'd grown up. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed New Orleans like an impossible watercolor, and she felt equally impossible in this setting. The 20-year age difference between them weighed like an invisible stone on her shoulders, reminding her with each passing second that perhaps she was playing a game for which she didn't know the rules. When the words finally escaped her lips, "I've never done this," she didn't expect to see that flash of genuine tenderness in his hazel eyes, much less hear the promise that would change the course of that night, and without her knowing it then, her entire existence. Because there are moments in life where time stops, where past and future collide in a present so intense it becomes eternal, and this was one of those moments. Life rarely warns us when we're about to cross thresholds that will transform us forever. There are no luminous signs or celestial voices. There are only fragile instants, whispered decisions, and the courage to tell the truth when it would be easier to lie. 12 months earlier, Ilara woke every day at 5 in the morning in the small apartment she shared with her grandmother Willa, in the heart of the Garden District, among the oak-lined streets of New Orleans. The smell of beignets from the bakery downstairs filled the air as she prepared for another day at the historic New Orleans collection, where she worked cataloging antique manuscripts and first editions that smelled of history and secrets kept between yellowed pages. At 21, her life was marked by a predictable and safe routine, exactly as she had planned after the traumatic events of adolescence that had taught her to build high walls around her heart. The apartment was small but cozy, with original crown molding in the kitchen, narrow windows overlooking streets lined with wrought-iron balconies, and the constant sound of tourists lost looking for the Garden District bookshop. Grandmother Willa, with her 84 years and wrinkled hands that had worked an entire lifetime, was her anchor and refuge. In the mornings, while Ilara dressed in long skirts and modest blouses that concealed more than they revealed, the elderly woman prepared chicory coffee and buttered toast, watching her with eyes that had seen too much suffering not to recognize it in others. "You're 21, child, not 80, she would say frequently, with that slow southern drawl that turned every word into music. "Life doesn't end because some scoundrel hurt you. It begins when you decide you deserve something better." But Ilara had learned that invisible scars hurt more than visible ones. Garrett, her boyfriend from 18 to 20, had been her first lesson about how love could transform into prison. The shouting, the pathological jealousy, the constant accusations, the way he controlled every aspect of her life while saying he did it out of love. When she finally found the courage to end that relationship 6 months earlier, she swore she would never again allow anyone to have that power over her. Work at the archive was her sanctuary. Among the dusty shelves and reverent silence of the reading rooms, she could breathe. Her long, delicate fingers carefully manipulated volumes centuries old, reading dedications from loves long dead, marginal notes from forgotten scholars, words that had survived their authors. The first encounter between them happened unexpectedly on a sudden rainy afternoon in April. Ilara was organizing a temporary exhibition on Southern Gothic literature when she heard the main door open urgently. Callum entered drenched, seeking shelter from the storm that had caught the city by surprise. He wore a navy blue suit that even wet maintained its elegance, a Rolex on his wrist that probably cost more than her 6-month salary, and an expression of slight irritation that transformed into curiosity when his eyes swept the interior of the archive. He didn't seem like the type of man who would frequent a historic collection. There was something in his posture, in the way he occupied space that spoke of boardrooms and multi-million-dollar decisions. But what surprised her was when he approached the counter, shaking raindrops from his dark hair graying at the temples, and asked with a Boston accent that was unmistakable, "Sorry for the disruption. The rain caught me nearby, and do you happen to have rare editions of William Faulkner? I'm specifically looking for The Sound and the Fury, the 1929 first edition." Ilara looked up from her work, meeting hazel eyes that seemed to evaluate and appreciate simultaneously. She had seen hundreds of visitors in the 2 years she'd worked there, but none like him. Not just because of the obvious class difference that was evident, but because of something harder to define, a contained intensity, a sharp intelligence hiding behind polite manners. "We have 2 editions of The Sound and the Fury," she responded, her voice firmer than she felt inside. "The 1929 edition is in our special collection. It requires authorization for consultation." "Understandable. It's a bibliographic gem." He smiled, and there was something genuine in that smile that disarmed her automatic defenses. "What about Flannery O'Connor?" "A good man is hard to find." During the 40 minutes the rain hammered against the tall windows, they talked about Southern Gothic literature, about the differences between Faulkner's stream of consciousness and O'Connor's grotesque realism, about how the right words could heal invisible wounds. He demonstrated a deep knowledge of literature that contrasted with his appearance as a successful businessman. She discovered that her shyness dissolved when talking about books, that she could maintain complex conversations about literary symbolism and historical contexts without stuttering. When the rain finally subsided, he didn't leave immediately. He stood looking out the window at the wet streets of the historic district, as if postponing something. Finally, he turned to her. "I'm Callum Rhodes. I'll be in New Orleans for a few weeks on business. Would you mind if I came back? Not just for the books, but because it's been years since I've had such an interesting conversation about literature." Ilara should have said no. She should have recognized the danger signals, the obvious interest in his eyes, the way his presence altered the rhythm of her heartbeats. But instead she heard herself responding, "The archive is open from 9 to 6, Monday through Friday." When he left a trail of rainwater on the marble floor and something intangible in the air that she couldn't name. That night, while having dinner with Grandmother Willer on the small balcony overlooking the streetcar line, she didn't mention the encounter. But her thoughts constantly returned to those hazel eyes and the way he had spoken of poetry, as if it were something vital, necessary to survive. Callum returned 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning when the May sun entered through the tall windows of the archive, creating rectangles of golden light on the floor. This time it wasn't raining, and he didn't need shelter excuses. He dressed more casually, dark jeans and a white Oxford shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, but the natural elegance remained intact. "I came for that O'Connor you mentioned," he said, but his eyes said something different. Over the following weeks, the visits became a constant that defied all logic. Each encounter brought new conversations, smiles that lasted a bit longer, looks that began to mean things neither had the courage to verbalize. Ilara discovered that he had built an empire in real estate development, creating projects in Boston, New York, and Atlanta, with offices employing hundreds of people. But he maintained a secret passion for Southern literature that few knew, a private refuge in the middle of the ruthless world of business. He discovered that she had a brilliant mind hidden behind shyness, that her way of describing manuscripts was like poetry itself, that there were emotional scars from an abusive past relationship that had made her give up trusting men. He knew not because she said it directly, but from the way she tensed when he got too close, from how her hands trembled when their fingers accidentally brushed passing a book, from the momentary panic in her eyes when he made a comment that could be interpreted as possessive. The 20-year age difference between them was something she noticed every time someone observed them with curiosity. When they had coffee at the small cafe across from the archive, she saw the looks from other customers, heard the barely disguised murmurs. He perceived her discomfort but never mentioned it, hoping that time and genuine connection would speak louder than numbers. One June afternoon, while organizing a section of first editions together, he asked, "Why do you work here? With your knowledge, you could be at universities, important museums." Ilara was silent for a moment, her fingers caressing the cover of a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The question touched something deep, something she rarely shared. "Stability," she finally responded. After difficult times, I needed something predictable. Here I know what to expect each day. There are no surprises, no disappointments. And is that enough? The absence of pain. It was a dangerous question, formulated with a gentleness that made it impossible to be offended. Ilara looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing beyond the suit and successful appearance. She saw the loneliness in the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders relaxed only when they were among books, away from his corporate world. "I don't know," she admitted, a truth she hadn't even allowed herself to think. "And for you, here's building towers and moving millions enough." It was Callum's turn to be silent. Outside, New Orleans vibrated with summer life. Tourists filled the narrow streets. Heat rose from the historic cobblestones. But inside the archive, in that suspended moment, two people began to recognize in each other a reflection of their own emptiness. "I used to think so," he finally said. "Now I'm not so sure." The first real obstacle came when Grandmother Willa fell ill. It was sudden and terrifying, chest pain during the 4th of July celebration that ended with an ambulance racing through the Garden District streets, while Ilara prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. The diagnosis was heart problems that would require expensive and prolonged treatment. Medical bills began accumulating at a breathtaking pace. The public healthcare system covered the basics, but specialized medications, the complementary treatments doctors strongly recommended, all of that fell on her shoulders. Ilara worked extra shifts, sold some belongings, including silver earrings that had been her mother's, dead when she was 12. But it wasn't enough. When Callum found out, weeks later because she had tried to hide it, his immediate reaction was to offer financial help. He told her on a Saturday afternoon, after visiting her at the hospital where her grandmother rested, connected to constantly beeping monitors. "Let me help. I can cover the medical expenses, the medications, everything she needs." Ilara felt as if she'd been slapped. Her face turned red, a mixture of shame and wounded pride. All her fears, all the insecurities about her emerging relationship with this rich and powerful man materialized in that moment. "No," she responded with a harshness that surprised them both. "I'm not a charity project, Callum. I'm not a poor young woman who needs to be rescued by an older, wealthy man." She walked away through the white hospital corridors, her shoes echoing against the linoleum, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed in front of him. The stereotype that terrified her, the image of herself as a gold digger or a naive girl taking advantage of an older man, had materialized in her own mind with that offer, however well-intentioned. Callum didn't follow her immediately. He remained in the hospital hallway, hands in pockets, understanding that he had made a fundamental mistake, not in offering help, but in not understanding what she really needed, not salvation, but respect. Not easy solutions bought with money, but recognition of her capacity to handle her own battles. A week passed without them speaking, a week in which Ilara worked like an automaton, visiting her grandmother in the morning before work, spending afternoons at the archive where now every corner reminded her of the conversations they had shared, and nights searching for financial solutions that didn't exist. Exhaustion marked itself in dark circles under her eyes, in the pallor of her skin, in the way her hands trembled when she signed checks that emptied her bank account. Grandmother Willa, even in her fragile state, noticed everything. One afternoon, when Ilara arrived to visit, she found Callum sitting beside the bed conversing quietly with the elderly woman. The initial panic transformed into confusion when her grandmother gestured for her to approach. "This man came to talk to me," Willa said with her voice still fragile but firm in intention. "Not to offer me money, but to offer you something more valuable. An opportunity." Ilara looked at Callum, who remained serious, almost nervous. "There's a collector in Charleston, Montgomery Ashford," he explained without preamble. "He owns one of the most important private libraries in the South. He needs someone to catalogue and organize his collection. I told him about you, about your work here, about your knowledge. He wants to hire you for 3 months, weekends. Pays triple your current salary." The offer hung suspended in the hospital air that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Ilara felt contradictory emotions, relief at the possibility of solving her financial problems, suspicion that this was still charity in disguise, gratitude for his consideration, and something deeper she didn't want to name. "Why?" she simply asked. Because you're brilliant at what you do, because Montgomery needs exactly your expertise, and because— He paused, carefully choosing words. Because I understood that you don't need someone to solve your problems, but someone to trust in your ability to solve them yourself. This isn't charity, Ilara. It's recognition of your talent. Grandmother Willa observed the exchange with astute eyes that had navigated 84 years of life and knew how to recognize true intentions. Accept it, child, the elderly woman said. Not for him, not for me, for you, because you deserve to be paid what you're worth. Ilara accepted, though part of her still resisted the idea that he had been the intermediary. The weekends in Charleston became exhausting but satisfying expeditions. Montgomery's library was an archaeological treasure of literature, with breathtaking first editions, manuscripts unseen by academic eyes for decades, bibliographic jewels that made her librarian's heart beat faster. The money she earned covered medical expenses with enough margin to breathe. But more important than that, it returned something she didn't know she had lost: the sense of her own value. Each book she catalogued, each system she implemented in the private collection, was tangible proof of her competence. During those months, her relationship with Callum transformed. It was no longer the benefactor trying to help, and she, the proud one, refusing assistance. They began to see each other as equals, two people with different but equally deep wounds, trying to navigate the attraction growing between them despite all the reasons it shouldn't. One August evening, after a particularly long day cataloguing a collection of correspondence between 19th-century poets, Callum was waiting for her at the Charleston train station to drive her back to New Orleans. The southern summer heat was stifling even at dusk, the air vibrating with the song of cicadas. In the car, while driving along the highway that wound between moss-draped live oaks under a peach-colored sky, he asked, "Have you ever allowed yourself to be simply happy, Ilara? Without analyzing, without protecting yourself, without waiting for everything to collapse?" The question caught her off guard. She looked out the window at the landscape passing swiftly, golden fields extending to the horizon. "Not for a long time," she admitted. "When you're happy without protecting yourself, the subsequent pain is devastating. I learned that the hard way. What if the pain never comes? What if protection prevents you from living something real? Are you speaking from experience?" Callum kept his eyes on the road, but his hands tensed on the steering wheel. "I'm 41, Ilara. I've built an empire, traveled the world, met hundreds of people. But honestly, until I walked into that archive in the rain, I hadn't felt a real connection in years. Maybe never. And now I'm afraid that my age, my world, my past mistakes will push you away before we have a chance to see what this could be." It was the first time he verbalized his own fears, and the vulnerability in his voice was so real it hurt to hear it. They arrived in New Orleans when stars already dotted the sky. He insisted on walking with her through the cobblestone streets of the Garden District to her apartment, even though it meant leaving the car down in the public parking lot. They climbed in silence, surrounded by the aroma of magnolias intensifying with the night, passing tourists taking photos of the Victorian mansions. In front of her door, under the yellowish light of an old street lamp, Ilara turned to him. "I'm afraid," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, "of feeling this. Of what it means, of the age difference, of what people will think, of not being enough for someone like you, but most of all, I'm afraid that when I finally lower my guard, you'll destroy me like I was destroyed before." Callum raised a hand, grazing her cheek with a delicacy that contrasted with his size, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "I can't promise I'll never hurt you. I'm human. I'll make mistakes. But I can promise it will never be intentional, that I'll never disrespect you, and that every day I'll try to deserve you. Age doesn't make me perfect, Ilara. It only makes me more aware of how rare and valuable it is to find something real." They kissed for the first time under that street lamp, a tentative and sweet kiss that tasted of possibilities and intertwined fears. When they separated, both were trembling slightly, aware that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Autumn arrived in New Orleans, painting the oaks along St. Charles Avenue in golds and russets. Grandmother Willa, recovered thanks to the treatment they could now afford, had returned to the Garden District apartment, more physically fragile but with eyes as astute as ever. She observed her granddaughter's transformation with a mixture of approval and concern, seeing how Ilara began to smile more frequently, how her hands no longer trembled constantly, how there was a glow in her gaze that had been absent for years. The relationship between Ilara and Callum deepened with each encounter, but not without resistance. She continued fighting her own internal demons against the voice insisting this was too good to be true, that a man like him would eventually see her youth as a defect rather than a quality, that the 20-year difference would become an impassable chasm. The first real public test came in September, when he invited her to a charity gala at the Audubon Park Clubhouse. It was a New Orleans high society event, successful business people, old aristocratic families, local politicians. The type of gathering where the clothes you wore and the contacts you had mattered as much as what you said. Ilara almost refused the invitation. The idea of being in that world, of being judged and measured against standards she didn't fully understand, terrified her. But Callum had asked with such sincerity that she finally accepted. On the night of the event, while looking at herself in the mirror of her tiny apartment bathroom, she almost regretted it. The navy blue dress she had managed to borrow from her cousin Thea was beautiful but simple, nothing compared to what other women would surely wear. Her makeup was minimal because she had never learned to apply it properly. Her chestnut hair she had pulled into a low chignon that she hoped looked elegant, but probably just looked outdated. Grandmother Willa appeared in the doorway, watching her with an expression mixing pride and memory. "You look beautiful, child." "But that's not what matters," she approached, placing her wrinkled hands on Ilara's shoulders. "What matters is that you remember who you are. Don't let anyone, not even with looks or whispers, make you feel less than your worth. You're 21, yes, and he's 41. So what? I married at 18 to your grandfather, who was 33. Different times, true, but love doesn't understand calendars." "But were you happy, Grandma?" "Really happy?" The elderly woman sighed, an exhalation containing decades of experience. "Your grandfather and I, it was complicated. The first years were difficult, full of misunderstandings and different expectations. But over time, we learned. You know what saved us? Mutual respect. When there's respect, everything else can be built. Without respect, not even love survives." Callum arrived punctually, driving a discreet but clearly luxurious Audi. When she came down from the building, he got out of the car and simply stood looking at her with an expression worth more than 1,000 words. He didn't say, "You look beautiful," automatically. Instead, he said, "You're going to be the most interesting person in that room tonight, and not because of how you look, but because of who you are." The gala at the Audubon Park Clubhouse was exactly as intimidating as she had imagined. The historic mansion was illuminated with soft lights, creating dancing shadows on the antebellum walls. Men in tuxedos and women in designer dresses Ilara had only seen in magazines chatted with champagne flutes, while a string quartet played classical music in the main hall. The stares began as soon as they entered together. Ilara felt them like invisible needles pricking her skin. She saw eyebrows raising, conversations whispered behind hands, merciless evaluations. She was young, came from a working neighborhood, didn't belong to that world, and Callum, successful and respected, was with her. The calculations in the minds of those present were almost audible, but what she didn't expect was Callum's reaction. Instead of treating her as a mere companion, he actively introduced her into conversations. Ilara is a specialist in American Southern literature. She works cataloging historical manuscripts at the Historic New Orleans Collection. "What do you think, Ilara, about the digitization project for Louisiana cultural heritage?" You should hear her analysis of Faulkner's narrative techniques. He placed her not as an ornament on his arm, but as an intellectual equal. And when an older businessman made a barely veiled comment about her youth, how refreshing to see new blood at these events, so young and vibrant, Callum responded with a firmness that admitted no debate. "Youth is not synonymous with inexperience, Harrison. Ilara has brought perspectives to my understanding of Southern culture that decades of living here hadn't given me. Age only marks years lived, not depth of thought." That night, Ilara learned something fundamental. Callum wasn't hiding her or being ashamed of her. On the contrary, he defended her publicly, risking his reputation in circles where appearances were everything. That was worth more than any declaration of love. However, the weight of belonging to such different worlds remained real. A week later, While eating po' boys at a small bar in the Bywater, with fried catfish and remoulade sauce, a group of Ilara's friends from college passed by. The way they looked at Callum, evaluating his age, his clearly expensive clothes, the way the intimacy between them was evident, made Ilara feel shame for the first time, not of herself, but of her situation. After her friends left with uncomfortable goodbyes and false promises to see each other soon, she remained silent, looking at the sweet tea in her glass. "I can hear your thoughts from here," Callum said softly. "They think I'm a gold digger, or that I have some unresolved daddy issues, or both. And do you care what they think?" It was a simple question, but impossible to answer easily. Did she care? Yes and no. Not because those assumptions were true, but yes because being constantly judged was exhausting. "I shouldn't care," she finally responded, "but it's hard to ignore when it's constant." The looks on the street, the veiled comments, the assumptions about us. Callum nodded, understanding without needing her to explain more. "I feel them too. From my side, the comments are different but equally harsh. That I'm having a midlife crisis, that I'm taking advantage of your youth and inexperience, that eventually I'll trade you for someone younger when you age." He paused. "And maybe the real question isn't whether we care what they think, but whether we're willing to build something real despite it." October brought unexpected changes. The gentrification that had been threatening the Garden District for years finally arrived at her street. Signs appeared announcing that the old building where Ilara lived with her grandmother would be renovated to become luxury tourist apartments. Tenants had 3 months to find new accommodations. The irony was cruel. A real estate company, the same type that had enriched Callum, was displacing families who had lived on those streets for generations. When Ilara mentioned this, perhaps expecting him to distance himself from the problem, his reaction was different. "What company is it?" he asked immediately, with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Gulf Coast Development Group." "Why?" Callum was thoughtful, his fingers drumming on the table of the small cafe where they had met. "I know the director. We've worked on joint projects in the past. Let me see what I can do." "I don't want more favors, Callum." The response came out sharper than intended, automatic defenses activating. "It's not a favor. It's justice. The Garden District is a national historic landmark. There are protocols, laws. If they're going to develop, they have to respect existing residents." During the following 2 weeks, Callum used his contacts and knowledge of the sector to apply pressure. He didn't stop the development. That was beyond his control. But he managed to get all tenants of the building to receive fair compensation and priority in new protected apartments his own company was developing in the warehouse district, units designed for local residents and not for tourists. For Ilara, this represented a deep internal conflict. On one hand, she was grateful for his intervention that saved her grandmother and neighbors from becoming victims of a ruthless system. On the other, she faced the reality that Callum operated in that same system, that his wealth came from transforming cities in ways that didn't always benefit original residents. One night, while packing belongings in the Garden District apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes and memories of an entire lifetime, they had the conversation that had been fermenting for weeks. "How do you reconcile it?" Ilara asked, wrapping old china in newspaper. "Building fortunes by transforming neighborhoods, while families like mine are displaced." Callum stopped packing books and sat on the dust-covered floor. For a moment he looked older than his 41 years, the weight of questions without easy answers visible in his shoulders. "I don't reconcile it completely. It's one of the contradictions I live with." His voice was serious, without defenses. "I started in this believing I was building, creating spaces where people could live better, and in many cases that's true. But over time, business hardens you. You start seeing numbers on spreadsheets instead of lives. It's easy to justify decisions saying it's just business. And now? Now I know the name of the lady on the second floor who will be displaced. Now I know your grandmother cultivated magnolias on that balcony for 30 years. Now I see the faces behind the numbers, and it's much harder to sleep at night." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest. And in that honesty, Ilara saw a man grappling with the moral consequences of his choices, not excusing them, but acknowledging them. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. "I'm restructuring. A portion of each future project will be dedicated to affordable housing for local residents. It doesn't solve everything, but it's a start. And I'm exploring a different project, something I want to discuss with you when you're ready." Before he could elaborate, Grandmother Willa entered the room, carrying a box full of old photographs. 52 years I've lived in this apartment," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I saw my daughter grow up here, lost her too young, raised my granddaughter between these walls. The good ghosts will stay here when we leave." That night, the three of them sat on the balcony one last time, watching the streetcar lights gliding through the darkness. Grandmother Willa told stories of her youth, of how she had married at 18 to a man 15 years older, of how she had navigated the social expectations of an even more rigid era than the current one. "My marriage wasn't easy," she admitted, her eyes lost in ancient memories. "Your grandfather was good but complicated. The first years we fought constantly. He expected a traditional wife, I had my own ideas. The age difference meant we came from different worlds, with different values. But you know what saved us? Mutual respect and the willingness to grow together. It's not about age, child. It's about whether both are willing to do the hard work of building something real." Her words floated in the magnolia-scented air, a testament passed from generation to generation about the complex nature of love and commitment. The following month brought a new crisis, this time from an unexpected front. Garrett, Ilara's abusive ex-boyfriend, reappeared during the Halloween celebrations on Frenchman Street. She saw him first on one of the narrow streets of the Marigny, his presence sending a jolt of panic through her body. The memories she had worked so hard to bury emerged violently. The shouting, the constant accusations, the way he had controlled every aspect of her life while saying he did it out of love. Garrett approached with the confidence of someone who had learned nothing, who still believed he had some right over her. "Ilara, I've been looking for you. We need to talk." "We have nothing to talk about, Garrett." She tried to pass, but he blocked her path. "I heard you're with someone. A rich old guy, right?" His tone was biting, loaded with venomous insinuations. "Always knew you'd look for the easy way out. Guess it's simpler to spread your legs for a businessman than to work honestly." The insult was like a physical blow. Ilara felt humiliation burning her cheeks, old insecurities rising. But something had changed in these months. She was no longer the 20-year-old who had accepted his abuse, believing love justified pain. "I'm not doing this with you," she said with a clarity that surprised them both. "I don't owe you explanations about my life. What I have with Callum is respectful, equal, and none of your miserable assumptions change that. You were abusive, controlling, and you almost destroyed me. But that's over. You have no power over me." "Power? Babe, you were always mine. I was never yours. And that was your problem, Garrett. You saw people as possessions." Callum appeared at that moment, coming from the opposite direction of the street. He must have caught the tension immediately because his posture changed, alert and protective without being aggressive. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking at Ilara first, then at Garrett. Garrett laughed bitterly. "Of course. Here's the knight in shining armor. How long do you think the interest will last, buddy?" "Until you find a 20-year-old model without baggage." Callum took a step forward, his voice low but with an edge of steel. "You don't know her if you think she needs rescuing. And honestly, your opinions about our relationship are completely irrelevant. Ilara has made her position clear. I suggest you respect it." Garrett looked between the two, seeing a unity he couldn't penetrate. Finally, with one last venomous comment about old men and gold diggers, he walked away down the cobblestone street. Ilara was trembling, but not from fear. It was adrenaline, anger, and a strange sense of triumph. For the first time in her life, she had confronted her abuser and won. Not because Callum was there, but because she had found her own voice. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "Yes." And it was true. "For the first time in a long time, I really am okay." Christmas in New Orleans has a particular charm. Lights adorn the streets of the French Quarter. The holiday market fills Jackson Square with aromas of pralines and hot cider, and families gather in a celebration that mixes religious tradition with secular joy. Ilara and her grandmother had moved to the new apartment in the warehouse district, a more modern space but carefully designed to preserve the cozy feeling of the old one. It was on Christmas Eve when Callum finally presented the project he had been mentioning. He invited her to the penthouse he maintained in New Orleans, a space on the top floor of a restored building with privileged views of the Mississippi River. The apartment reflected his personality, elegant minimalism combined with touches of warmth, bookshelves filled with first editions, contemporary art on the walls. He prepared dinner himself, something that surprised her. She didn't expect a businessman accustomed to expensive restaurants to know how to move in a kitchen, but he prepared shrimp and grits with the confidence of someone who had learned from Louisiana masters, accompanied by fresh greens and cornbread. While they ate, with the Crescent City connection illuminated like a necklace of lights through the windows, he pulled out a leather folder. "I want to show you something. A project I've been developing, but it only makes sense if you're part of it." Ilara opened the folder, finding architectural plans, financial projections, demographic studies. But what captured her attention were drawings of luminous spaces filled with shelves, cozy reading areas, computer rooms. "Community libraries," Callum explained, his voice loaded with an enthusiasm he rarely showed. "Not just buildings with books, but complete cultural centers. Spaces where children from disadvantaged neighborhoods can access educational resources, where adults can take digital literacy classes, where the community can gather. I want to build a network of these libraries throughout Louisiana, starting here in New Orleans." "It's beautiful," Ilara said sincerely, her fingers tracing the plans. "But why me?" "Because buildings are nothing without content. I can construct structures, but you know how to transform them into living spaces. Your knowledge of library science, your understanding of what communities need, your passion for making literature accessible, that's what's missing in my world of concrete and steel." He opened a second folder, this time legal documents. "I'm not offering you a job, Ilara. I'm offering you a partnership, 50-50. Co-founder of Bridges of Words, a social enterprise dedicated to creating and maintaining community libraries. You would direct all content and cultural programming aspects. I would handle construction and financing." Ilara felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. This wasn't charity or an empty romantic gesture. It was a serious business proposal that recognized her expertise and treated her as an equal. "Callum, I'm 21. I don't have experience running companies. I don't have—" "You have exactly what's needed," he interrupted firmly. "Intelligence, passion, specialized knowledge, and real connection with the communities we want to serve. The rest can be learned. You'd have access to consultants, mentors, training. But the vision, the heart of the project, that can only come from someone who truly understands the transformative power of books." Tears surprised Ilara, falling onto the architectural plans. They weren't tears of sadness, but of something more complex. Recognition, validation, the overwhelming weight of an opportunity that would completely change her life. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you risk so much on me?" Callum stood from the table, walked to the windows where New Orleans stretched below them, the old city and the new blending in a mosaic of lights. "Because in 41 years, I've met many brilliant people, but most have forgotten the purpose beyond profit. You'll never forget. Every decision you make will consider the impact on real lives, on children who need books, on adults who deserve second educational chances. And honestly, because building this with you would give meaning to decades of accumulating resources that until now I've used mainly to accumulate more resources." He turned to her, his expression serious. "I'm not doing this for you, Ilara. I'm doing it with you. There's a huge difference. And if you decide it's not right for you, I'll respect that. But before deciding, I want you to consider not just the fears, but the possibilities." Ilara spent the following days in a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. She consulted her grandmother, who simply said, "Opportunities like this don't come twice. Fear is natural, but cowardice would be letting fear decide for you." She talked with colleagues from the archive, some of whom expressed veiled skepticism about her capabilities to manage a project of such magnitude at her age. New Year's Eve arrived with its symbolic load of endings and beginnings. Callum had invited her to the penthouse to celebrate, and she had accepted, knowing that her decision about the project couldn't be postponed any longer. The penthouse was decorated with discreet elegance, soft lights, ambient music in the background. He had prepared the traditional 12 grapes, and 2 champagne flutes waited on the balcony table. It was in that setting, while the church bells began to ring in the distance, marking the end of one year and the beginning of another, that Ilara made the decision that would change everything. "I accept," she said simply when the last bells resonated. "I want to build this with you." It terrifies me, but I want it. Callum smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated his face, making the lines around his eyes deepen in an expression of pure joy. You don't know how much this means to me. They kissed as fireworks began exploding over New Orleans, the city surrendering to celebration. But it was afterward, when the initial euphoria calmed and they simply stood watching the river lights, that the most significant moment occurred. I've never done this, Ilara said suddenly, her voice loaded with a different vulnerability. What? Callum asked, confused. This. Trusting someone completely, surrendering without reserves. Every time I've gotten close to this, scars from the past stopped me. I'm 21 and I already feel damaged in ways I don't know if I can repair. Callum took her hands, holding them with a tenderness that contrasted with his size. Then we'll go slowly, at your pace. There's no rush when it's real. There were tears in his eyes when he added, I'm 20 years older than you, but that's taught me to value what's rare and true. And you, Ilara, are the most real thing I've ever found. The first months of the new year brought the concrete reality behind promises and plans. Creating bridges of words wasn't the romantic process Ilara had naively imagined. It was endless meetings with lawyers who spoke in incomprehensible legal jargon, negotiations with city officials who viewed the project with skepticism, financial analyses that made her head ache. Ilara had resigned from her secure position at the historic New Orleans collection in February, a leap of faith that terrified her every time she thought about it. The new apartment she had managed to rent in the Marigny, her first truly owned space, was half empty because her savings had evaporated in the initial costs of establishing the company. At 22 years freshly turned, she found herself sitting in meetings with 50-year-old architects who looked with barely disguised disdain when she expressed opinions about space design. Local business people who assumed she was simply the young girlfriend of Callum, with no real role in the project. City officials who directed all questions to him, ignoring her even when the topic was specifically her area of expertise. The first real fall occurred in March, during a crucial presentation before the New Orleans City Council. They had prepared for weeks, perfecting every detail of the proposal to convert an abandoned building in the 9th Ward neighborhood into the first community library. Ilara had to present the educational and cultural vision, while Callum would cover the financial and development aspects. But when her turn came to speak, before a room full of council members, city advisors, and community representatives, her mind went blank. The words she had rehearsed 1,000 times evaporated. She felt everyone's eyes fixed on her, judging her youth, her nervousness, probably wondering what a 22-year-old girl was doing pretending to lead a project of such magnitude. She stuttered, her hands trembling as she held notes that suddenly seemed written in a foreign language. The silence in the room was deafening. Callum, sitting beside her, didn't intervene immediately. He could have taken control and saved the presentation. But instead, he placed a hand gently on the table, a discreet gesture of support without taking the spotlight from her. Ilara breathed deeply, closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, forced the words out. Libraries aren't just buildings with books, she began, her voice still tremulous but gaining strength. They're portals to possibilities. In the 9th Ward, there are children who've never had access to a computer with internet. Teenagers whose potential is wasted because they don't have educational resources. Adults who want to learn but have nowhere to go. This library isn't a luxury. It's basic necessity disguised as culture, she continued, finding her rhythm, speaking from the heart more than prepared notes. She spoke of the girl she had been growing up in the Garden District, with limited access to resources, but with an archive that had been her salvation. She spoke of how books had been windows to worlds her economic circumstance would never have physically allowed her to know. When she finished, there was polite applause, but more importantly, she saw thoughtful nods among some council members, and a community representative from the 9th Ward approached afterward to say, "You speak like someone who understands." However, that didn't prevent the project from being rejected. The official reasons were limited budget and need for more impact studies. The real reasons, Ilara suspected, had more to do with local politics, with favoritism toward established companies, with resistance to supporting a project partially led by someone considered too young and inexperienced. The rejection was devastating. Ilara spent the night after the vote in her empty apartment, crying from frustration and doubt. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she had been naive to think she could do this. Maybe she should have kept her secure job at the archive, her predictable life without risks. Callum arrived close to midnight, using the key she had given months ago. He found her on the living room floor, surrounded by papers from the rejected proposal. "This is my fault," Ilara said before he could speak. "I froze. If I had presented better." "You presented perfectly." He sat beside her on the floor. "The rejection had nothing to do with your performance and everything to do with political maneuvering neither of us could control. But if you were doing this alone without me as dead weight, you're not dead weight." His voice was firm. "And if I were doing this alone, it would be another soulless urban development project. We failed today, yes. But failing is part of building anything meaningful. How can you not regret it?" The question came out loaded with desperation. "You bet on me, risked your reputation, and I failed." Callum looked at her for a long time before responding. "In the 20 years I have on you, I've launched 12 major projects. 5 failed completely, 2 were mediocre, only 5 were truly successful. That's the real ratio for anyone who tries to innovate. Failure doesn't disqualify you, Ilara. It educates you. The question isn't whether you'll fail, but whether you'll learn when you do." But his words, however well-intentioned, couldn't reach the dark place where Ilara had sunk. The doubt she had kept at bay for months emerged with renewed force, not just about her ability to lead the project, but about the relationship itself. "Maybe this is too much," she said softly. "Maybe we're too different. You with your experience and resources, me still trying to figure out who I am. Maybe the age difference really matters when it comes to truly being on equal footing." It was the first time she verbalized the core insecurity that had been gnawing at her confidence. Callum remained silent for a moment, that felt eternal. "If you really believe that," he finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "then maybe you're right. I can't convince you of your own value. That's something only you can discover. But don't confuse a professional setback with personal incompatibility. They're separate things." He left shortly after, leaving her with her spiraling thoughts. And for the first time since they had started this relationship, Ilara wondered if they had made a monumental mistake, if love, however real it was enough when the rest of the world seemed to conspire against them. The following days were the darkest since Ilara had ended her relationship with Garrett. She plunged into a self-destructive pattern of isolation, avoiding Callum's calls, ignoring her grandmother's messages, losing hours simply staring at the walls of her half-empty apartment. The voices in her head were merciless. "You're not enough. Never were. He'll eventually realize it and trade you for someone at his level. You're an imposter playing at being an entrepreneur when you can't even handle a basic presentation." Grandmother Willa finally appeared uninvited, using her own emergency key. She found Ilara still in pajamas at 3 in the afternoon, the apartment in disarray, takeout food half-eaten scattered across the kitchen counter. "That's enough," the elderly woman said with a firmness that admitted zero debate. "Get up, shower. And then we're going to talk like adults." Ilara wanted to resist, but something in her grandmother's expression, not compassion, but demand for more, motivated her to obey. An hour later, showered and dressed, she sat across from her grandmother on the small balcony overlooking Frenchman Street. "Tell me what's really going on," Willa ordered. Everything came out in a disorganized torrent. The rejected project, doubts about her capabilities, fear that the age difference with Callum meant they would never be true equals, the constant question of whether being with him had been a mistake from the beginning. Her grandmother listened without interrupting, her astute eyes evaluating every word, every inflection. When Ilara finally ran out of words, exhausted by the outpouring, Willa spoke with the wisdom of someone who had navigated 84 years of life. "I'm going to tell you something hard, and I don't want you to take it as cruelty but as truth. You're using age as an excuse." Ilara opened her mouth to protest, but her grandmother raised a hand. "Let me finish. Yes, there are 20 years between you. Yes, he has more professional experience. Yes, the world will judge you. But the real problem isn't age. It's that you don't believe in yourself. And as long as you don't, you'll look for any external excuse to justify why you don't really try." Callum's age is just the most convenient. The words hit like stones, painful, because they contained truth Ilara had been avoiding facing. You failed at a presentation, her grandmother continued. So what? Your grandfather went bankrupt twice before finding a business that worked. I lost 3 pregnancies before having your mother. Life is full of failures. The question isn't whether you're going to fall, but whether you're going to lie on the ground feeling like a victim, or whether you're going to get up and learn. But what if I'm not good enough for this? For either thing, not the project or the relationship. Then you'll discover that by genuinely trying, not by sabotaging yourself before you really start. The elderly woman took Ilara's hands between hers, wrinkled but strong. The difference between you and Callum isn't fundamentally age. It's that he's failed enough times to know that failure doesn't define your worth. You're still learning that. How do you overcome fear? You don't overcome it. You learn to act despite it. That's true courage. That conversation marked a turning point, though the transformation wasn't immediate. Over the following weeks, Ilara began the slow work of rebuilding herself. She contacted each council member who had voted against the project, not to complain but to understand their specific objections and learn how to address them better in future proposals. She took an online course on non-profit project management. She talked with directors of other community libraries around the country, learning from their experiences. And finally, after almost a month of silence, she called Callum. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting. "I need to apologize," she said without preamble. "Not for failing at the presentation, but for running away afterward. For blaming you and our age difference for my own insecurities." "You don't need to apologize for having doubts," he responded, his voice warm. "But I need you to know that I can't convince you of your value. That's internal work only you can do. I know, and I'm working on it. But I also need you to be patient. This believing in myself thing. It's not natural for me yet. I'm 41, Ilara. Patience is something that comes with the territory." They met in person days later, at the same cafe where they had so often shared beignets and chicory coffee. There was an initial awkwardness, the distance created by weeks of silence weighing between them. But gradually, as they talked about their separate experiences during that time, the connection began to re-establish itself. "There were moments where I thought you'd decided this was too much," Callum admitted. "And if that had been your conclusion, I would have respected it. But I'm glad it wasn't. It wasn't the relationship that scared me. It was me, my capacity to be who I thought I could be. And now? Now I'm terrified but willing to try again." April brought first signs of renewal. Ilara and Callum, working this time with a deeper understanding of political and bureaucratic obstacles, restructured their proposal. Instead of seeking municipal approval first, they decided to demonstrate the concept with private funds. Callum contacted investors in his network, people who had made fortunes in technology, banking, tourism. Ilara prepared presentations that didn't just talk about numbers, but about real human impact, concrete stories of how lack of access to educational resources affected lives in specific New Orleans neighborhoods. This time, when she presented, she did so with calculated vulnerability. She didn't pretend to be a 50-year-old expert with decades of experience. Instead, she spoke from her unique perspective as someone who had grown up in these communities, who understood barriers from within, who could translate real needs because she had lived them. And it worked. Investors who had initially shown skepticism found themselves moved by her authenticity. One woman, director of a family foundation focused on education, said after the presentation, "I've heard hundreds of pitches about social projects. Most are delivered by expensive consultants who've never set foot in the neighborhoods they're talking about. You speak with real authority. That's worth more than any MBA." They secured funding for a pilot project, a small community library in the 9th Ward, built not with municipal funds, but with private social impact investment. It wasn't the grand vision they had initially imagined, but it was a tangible beginning. During those months of rebuilding, the relationship between Ilara and Callum also evolved. There was less idealization, more reality. They argued, didn't always agree, navigated differences that came both from distinct personalities and life experiences separated by 2 decades. But they learned to fight constructively, without personal attacks, without threats of abandonment. One May evening, while reviewing construction contracts in her apartment. They had one of those fundamental discussions that define relationships. Ilara wanted the library to have extended hours, open until 10 at night, to accommodate workers who couldn't visit during the day. Callum argued that this would require additional staff that would inflate the budget beyond sustainable for a pilot. "It's not just about numbers," Ilara insisted, her frustration growing. "It's about real accessibility. What's the point of building this if the people who need it most can't use it? I understand the principle, but if it's not financially sustainable, it'll close in 6 months. Does that help anyone? You always find fiscal reasons to limit impact. Maybe that's why your other projects are successful but soulless." It was a low blow, and she knew it as soon as the words left her mouth. Callum fell silent, his jaw tightening. "That was unfair," he finally said, his voice controlled. "I'm trying to help you build something that lasts, not just something that feels good for 6 months before collapsing. But you're right about one thing. We come from different places. You prioritize immediate impact. I prioritize long-term sustainability. And maybe that difference really does have to do with age and experience." Ilara felt the sting of his words. Part of her wanted to escalate the fight, defend her position with more arguments, but the newer version of her, the one learning to exist, paused. "You're right," she admitted. "I'm sorry. That was a personal attack when we should be discussing strategy. And I should consider that sometimes my experience makes me too cautious. There's value in your urgency, in not automatically accepting compromises." Eventually they found middle ground, extended hours 3 days a week, starting with committed community volunteers and evaluating demand before hiring additional permanent staff. "This is how it works, isn't it?" Ilara said after resolving the disagreement. "We won't always agree. We won't always immediately understand each other's perspective. But if we respect each other and are willing to seek solutions instead of victories, we can build something together that neither of us could create alone." It was a lesson about partnership that transcended the professional, applying equally to their personal relationship. As construction of the pilot library began, Ilara faced challenges she hadn't anticipated. Construction workers, who didn't take her seriously when she gave instructions about interior space design. Suppliers who assumed Callum was the real decision-maker and directed all questions to him. The constant need to prove her competence in every interaction. There was a particularly frustrating incident with the main contractor, a 50-year-old man who repeatedly ignored specifications she had given about shelving layout, implementing instead what made sense according to his experience with traditional libraries. When Ilara confronted him, he responded with condescension. "Look, sweetheart, I know you're enthusiastic, but I've been building for 30 years. Libraries work a certain way. Trust the professionals." Before, Ilara would have backed down or sought Callum to intervene. But this time, with a firm voice and documentation in hand, she said, "I'm co-founder and content director of this project. The specifications I gave are based on community use studies and user-centered design. They're not whims. They're informed decisions. You can implement them as specified, or we can find a contractor who will." The man looked at her with surprise, re-evaluating. Finally, he nodded with newly discovered respect. "Understood. We'll do it according to your specifications." When Ilara told Callum about the incident that night, he smiled with genuine pride. "A year ago, what would you have done?" "I would have cried in the bathroom and then asked you to intervene." "And today?" "Today I stood up for myself. And it felt good. Scary, but good. That's real growth, Ilara. Not the absence of fear, but action despite it." The inauguration of the 9th Ward Community Library was scheduled for early July, coinciding with the end of the school year. The last months had been a whirlwind of frenetic activity, Ilara coordinating book selection, educational program design, community volunteer recruitment, Callum supervising final construction details, ensuring every element met safety codes and accessibility specifications. The transformed building was beautiful in a humble but meaningful way. They had preserved original architectural elements, exposed wooden beams, arched windows, while adding modernity with updated technology and optimized natural lighting. The walls were painted in warm tones that invited rather than intimidated. There were cozy corners with cushions for small children, computer stations for teenagers, study rooms for adults. But beyond the physical structure, Ilara had created something more intangible, a sense of belonging. She had spent weeks in the Ninth Ward, not just planning, but listening. She talked with mothers in the park about what they needed for their children. She spoke with teenagers on street corners about what would attract them to an educational space. She sat with elderly residents at the community center, asking what had been missing in their own lives that they wanted for following generations. The books she selected reflected those conversations. Not just literary classics, but also practical guides on parenting, healthy cooking on a budget, basic home repair. There were entire sections dedicated to Vietnamese literature for the neighborhood's significant immigrant population, computers with language learning software, a small cafe where people could gather without pressure to constantly consume. A week before the inauguration, while doing final inventory, Callum found Ilara sitting on the floor of the children's section, reading an illustrated book about a girl who dreamed of traveling the world. "Everything okay?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Just thinking. A year ago, I was cataloguing books at a historic archive, living a perfectly predictable and safe life. And now," she gestured, encompassing the space, "now I'm about to open something that could change real lives. It's scary. Regretful. Not for a second. But it's overwhelming thinking about the responsibility." Callum took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "You know what I see when I look at this place? I don't just see a building we constructed. I see your vision made real. Every design choice, every book on these shelves, every program you created, that's all you. I just provided resources and structure. You provided the soul. It wouldn't have been possible without your support. True, but it's also true that without your passion and understanding of these communities, this would have been just another pretty building without real impact. We're good together, Ilara, not despite our differences, but because of them." The inauguration arrived with bright Louisiana summer sun. They had invited Ninth Ward residents, city officials, the investors who had made the project possible, representatives from other community organizations. Ilara had insisted the event not be formal or intimidating, so there was jambalaya for everyone, live music from a local brass band, and activities for children outside. When the time came for speeches, Ilara stepped up to the small platform set up in the courtyard, looking at the sea of faces before her. Some familiar from her weeks working in the neighborhood, others completely new. She saw Grandmother Willa in the front row, tears already shining in her eyes. She saw Callum to the side, giving her an encouraging smile, but letting this be her moment. "A year and a half ago," she began, her voice trembling slightly but firm, "someone offered me an opportunity that terrified me, asked me to believe I was capable of more than I myself believed possible. And honestly, for a long time I thought he was wrong. I thought my youth, my lack of experience, my fears disqualified me." She paused, looking at the building behind her. "But building this place taught me something fundamental. Inexperience isn't the same as inability. Not knowing how to do something means you have to learn, not that you can't do it. And sometimes not being tied to how things have always been done allows you to imagine something better." She saw nods among the audience, particularly from younger Ninth Ward residents. "This library exists because someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. But more importantly, it exists because you, this community, shared your needs and dreams. Every book, every program, every space was designed listening to you. This isn't our gift to you. It's your space, built with your input, for your families." The applause was warm and genuine. But the most significant moment came afterward, when a middle-aged woman approached, a mother of 3 children Ilara had met during her community conversations. "My 14-year-old son just told me he wants to come here after school," the woman said, her eyes moist. "It's been months since I've seen him excited about anything educational. I just wanted to thank you for seeing value in our neighborhood, when many only see problems." That type of interaction repeated throughout the event. Elderly residents thanking for having a place where they could gather. Young mothers excited about parenting support programs. Teenagers asking about the coding and graphic design classes that would be offered. When the sun began to set over New Orleans, painting the sky in oranges and pinks, Ilara and Callum stood on the building's roof, watching the city stretch beneath them. "We did it," she said softly, still processing the reality. "You did it. I just opened some doors." "No, We did it together. And that's the difference. Callum embraced her from behind, his chin resting on her head. You know what's most beautiful about today? It's not the building, not the speeches, not even the satisfaction of completing the project. It's seeing in your eyes that you finally believe in yourself as much as I've always believed in you. He was right. Something fundamental had changed in Ilara during the months building this project. It wasn't that fears had completely disappeared, but she had learned she could act effectively even with fear, that courage wasn't the absence of doubts, but action despite them. The success of the pilot library in the Ninth Ward brought unexpected attention. Articles in local newspapers, an interview on local news about innovative social enterprises, invitations to present at conferences on community development. Suddenly, Bridges of Words wasn't just a local project but a potentially replicable model. With that attention came new opportunities. 3 different municipalities in Louisiana, 2 in rural parishes, 1 in Baton Rouge, contacted expressing interest in replicating the model. Additional investors approached, offering funding for expansion. A university in Boston invited Ilara to give a talk on user-centered community space design, but also came intensified resistance. Competitors in the real estate sector, who saw Callum's transition towards social projects as weakness, murmuring he was being manipulated by a young girlfriend. Critics who argued community libraries were antiquated solutions in the digital age. And, most painfully, voices within the target communities themselves questioning whether a middle-class girl from the Garden District could really understand the needs of more disadvantaged neighborhoods. Callum's family, particularly his mother Vivian, increased their opposition as the relationship became more public. At a tense dinner in Boston in August, the New England matriarch finally expressed her objections without filter. "I understand you're attracted to her youth, Callum," Vivian said in her crisp Boston accent, "but a serious relationship with someone her age, what can you really have in common? What future can you build when you're at completely different life stages?" Ilara, sitting beside Callum, felt the familiar burn of humiliation and anger. Callum responded with firmness. "Mother, with all due respect, what Ilara and I have in common is more substantial than anyone you've approved of in the past. We share values, passions, visions of the future. Age is just a number on an ID card. Numbers have meaning, son. When you're 60, she'll be 40. When you're 70, when I'm 60, we'll have spent 20 years building something together. Or not, but that decision isn't yours." Vivian turned to Ilara then, evaluating her with cold eyes. "What do you really want from my son? Financial security? Connections your social class wouldn't give you otherwise?" It was the type of direct attack that years ago would have devastated Ilara. But the woman who had built a library from scratch, who had faced dozens of rejections and criticisms, who had learned to defend her worth, responded with calm and dignity. "I want the same thing any person wants in a relationship: mutual respect, support, genuine connection. If your concern is that I'm with Callum for wrong reasons, I can assure you I've worked hard for every success I've had. I don't need anyone to rescue me financially. What I have with your son is a partnership of equals, both personally and professionally." She paused, carefully choosing the next words. "And with respect, Mum, age doesn't guarantee maturity or compatibility. I know couples the same age who are miserable together, and others with large age differences who are immensely happy. What matters is how we treat each other, not the dates on our birth certificates." Vivian didn't respond, but her expression suggested Ilara had earned, if not her approval, at least a degree of respect for not bowing. The trip back to New Orleans was tense. Callum drove in silence while Ilara looked out the window at the southern landscape passing. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he finally said. "It wasn't your fault. Your mother has a right to her opinions, even if I disagree. Her opinions about our relationship shouldn't dictate it." "They don't. But Callum," Ilara turned to look at him, "I need to ask you something honestly. Do you ever regret it? Being with someone 20 years younger, all the complications that brings?" He took her hand without taking his eyes off the road. "I regret that you have to face constant judgment. I regret that my age is used to invalidate our bond. But regret being with you? Never. Not a single day. Even when it's hard? Especially when it's hard. Easy things are rarely worth it." Back in New Orleans, Professional challenges continued accumulating. Expanding bridges of words required not just more funding, but more complex organizational infrastructure. They needed to hire permanent staff, establish impact evaluation systems, create replicable protocols for new locations. Ilara found herself in increasingly unfamiliar territory. Running a small pilot project was one thing. Scaling an organization was completely different. She made mistakes, hired someone based on personal impression who turned out not to have necessary technical skills, underestimated budgets for the second project in rural Louisiana, allowed pressure to expand quickly to compromise programming quality. Each mistake was a painful lesson. But it was also evidence she was operating at the edge of her capacity, growing in real time. Callum could have simply assumed control, using his experience to avoid these stumbles. But he understood Ilara needed to make her own mistakes to develop true expertise. There were moments of conflict between them when their leadership styles clashed. Ilara tended to be idealistic, willing to sacrifice efficiency for maximum inclusivity. Callum was pragmatic, always calculating long-term sustainability. Both approaches had value. Finding balance was the constant challenge. One night, after a particularly heated discussion about whether to accept a corporate sponsorship that came with restrictions on programming, Ilara said something that had been fermenting for months. "Sometimes I feel like we're building two different things. You want a successful social enterprise. I want maximum community impact. And those objectives don't always align." Callum looked at her thoughtfully before responding. "You're right that we sometimes prioritize different things, but that's not weakness, it's strength. We need your insistence on maintaining mission integrity. We need my insistence on maintaining financial sustainability. Without both, this doesn't work. But what happens when we really can't find compromise? When we have to choose, then we use the framework we established from the beginning. If a compromise betrays fundamental values, we don't do it regardless of financial benefit. But if it's just about different methods to reach the same goals, we keep negotiating until we find a solution." It was a reminder that the partnership between them, both professional and romantic, required constant work, continuous communication, willingness to remain in the discomfort of disagreement until reaching clarity. October marked the first anniversary of that New Year's Eve night that had changed everything. In that year, Ilara had gone from being a timid 21-year-old librarian to recognized co-founder of a growing social enterprise. She had learned to present with confidence, to negotiate with city officials, to lead teams, to maintain her vision, even under pressure. But the biggest challenge was still to come. The city of New Orleans, the same one that had rejected their original proposal, approached in November with a proposition. They wanted Bridges of Words to assume management of 3 existing municipal libraries that were underutilized and facing possible closure. It would be the largest project to date, with significant budget, but also high expectations and intense public scrutiny. The offer was both opportunity and test. Success would mean complete validation of their model, resources to expand dramatically, institutional credibility. Failure would mean not just reputational damage, but potentially the end of Bridges of Words as a viable organization. Ilara and Callum spent weeks evaluating the proposal. The municipal libraries were large spaces in strategic neighborhoods, but they also came with unionized staff resisting change, inherited rigid policies, communities skeptical about privatization of public services. "It's a trap," Ilara argued one night, reviewing contracts. "They're offering us libraries that failed under municipal management, so that when we fail, they can point to us as proof alternative models don't work." Or, Callum counter-argued, "it's an opportunity to demonstrate our approach works at larger scale. Yes, they're putting obstacles, but we can negotiate terms that give us real autonomy. What if we can't? What if we publicly fail after everything we've built?" Callum was silent, seriously considering the question. "Then we publicly fail, and we survive it, learn and move forward. Fear of failure can't dictate every decision." It was a version of the conversation they'd had dozens of times. Ilara's impulse toward protective caution versus Callum's willingness to take calculated risks. What had changed was that now Ilara could recognize when her resistance came from legitimate analysis versus when it came from fear. After consultations with their small team, with community leaders, with mentors they'd met during the year, they made the decision. They would accept the project, but only with significant contract modifications that guaranteed real programmatic autonomy. Negotiations extended for weeks. There were moments where it seemed everything would fall apart, where municipal demands were unacceptable, and bridges of words counterproposals were considered excessive. Ilara learned to negotiate not as supplicant, but as equal, understanding they had something valuable to offer, proven expertise in revitalizing library spaces. Finally, in December, they reached an agreement. Bridges of Words would manage the 3 libraries with 3-year contracts, complete autonomy over programming and staff, but with clearly defined success metrics they would have to meet. The contract signing was public, with media presence. The New Orleans mayor spoke about innovation in public services. Ilara spoke about community accountability and commitment to excellence. The photos taken that day showed a 22-year-old signing documents that would affect thousands of lives, beside a 42-year-old whose expression of pride was impossible to hide. But the real test began afterward. Taking over 3 existing libraries wasn't like building a new one from scratch. There was resistance from staff fearing job loss, communities skeptical about changes, politicians waiting for failure to validate their own prejudices. The first month was chaotic. Ilara spent 12 hours daily visiting the 3 locations, meeting with staff, listening to complaints and fears, trying to build trust while implementing necessary changes. The pressure was immense, the scrutiny constant. There was a particular moment in January that almost broke her. One of the most senior librarians, a 55-year-old woman who had worked in the municipal system for 30 years, confronted her publicly during a staff meeting. "You're a child playing at being an entrepreneur," the woman spat. "What do you know about running libraries? What do you know about the real needs of this community after your 22 years on the planet?" The room fell silent. All eyes were on Ilara, evaluating how she would handle this direct challenge to her authority and capacity. She breathed deeply, feeling the impulse to defend herself aggressively or collapse under the attack. But instead, she chose a third path. "You're right," she said calmly. "I don't know everything about running libraries. I haven't lived as long as you. I don't have your decades of experience. But I know some things. I know how to listen to communities. I know traditional models haven't been working, which is why these libraries were facing closure. And I know change is scary but necessary." She paused, looking not just at the woman who had confronted her, but at all the gathered staff. "I'm not here to replace your experience. I'm here to combine it with new approaches. Your knowledge about this community, your understanding of usage patterns over decades, that's invaluable. But we also need to adapt to how people consume information now, to changing family needs. It's not young versus old, traditional versus modern. It's finding the synthesis that best serves the community." She extended her hand to the woman. "Are you willing to work with me on that? Because honestly, I need your experience as much as you all need adaptation. None of us can do this alone." The gesture disarmed the hostility. The veteran librarian looked at the extended hand for a long moment before shaking it with a cautious nod. "It won't be easy," the woman warned. "Nothing worth it is," Ilara responded. That moment marked a turning point. It didn't eliminate all resistance, but it opened channels of communication. The following weeks brought gradual collaboration, with more veteran staff contributing institutional knowledge, while Ilara introduced user-centered design methodologies, innovative programming, and technology use. Results began showing. At the library in Mid-City, they implemented night hours with workshops for day shift workers. Attendance tripled in the first month. At the one in Algiers, they created a mentorship program where local professionals offered career guidance to youth. At the one in Trem, they transformed an underutilized space into a maker's room with 3D printers, podcasting equipment, and graphic design stations. Each small success built momentum, but it also increased pressure. Expectations were high, and any stumble was magnified by critics waiting for validation of their failure predictions. The climax came in March, during a surprise city audit. Municipal officials arrived without prior notice, reviewing every aspect of operations: finances, programming, staff satisfaction, community usage metrics. It was clearly an attempt to find irregularities or contractual breaches. Ilara and her team spent days answering questions, providing documentation justifying every decision. The pressure was suffocating. There were moments where Ilara locked herself in the office bathroom, allowing herself 5 minutes of panic before recomposing and continuing. Callum was present but didn't interfere, understanding this was something Ilara needed to handle with her own authority. He was there for emotional support, for nighttime conversations where she processed stress, but not to solve problems for her. One particularly difficult night, when the audit had revealed some minor inconsistencies in financial reports requiring correction, Ilara arrived at Callum's penthouse exhausted and demoralized. "They're looking for excuses to cancel the contract," she said, dropping onto the sofa. "Every small error is amplified. They hold us to standards they never applied to previous municipal management." "Probably," Callum agreed, sitting beside her. "But that means they have to look very hard to find problems. If you were really failing, they wouldn't need to amplify minor errors." "I don't know if I can do this, Callum. The constant scrutiny, the impossible expectations, the feeling that one mistake could destroy everything we've built." He took her face between his hands, forcing her to look at him. "A year ago, would you have imagined yourself doing what you're doing now? Running 3 libraries, leading a team of 20 people, negotiating with city officials? No, but you're doing it, and you're doing it well. The minor errors they found are exactly that. Minor. Correctable. They don't invalidate the massive impact you've already had. What if it's not enough? Then we'll have tried something difficult and valuable, and that's never real failure, Ilara. The only true failure is not trying because of fear." The words were an echo of conversations they'd had dozens of times during the 1.5 years of their relationship, but now they resonated differently because Ilara had tangible evidence of her capacity. Transformed libraries, impacted communities, lives changed by access to resources she had made possible. The audit finally concluded with a report acknowledging minor areas needing improvement, but confirming that Bridges of Words was meeting contractual terms and exceeding established impact metrics. Attendance at the 3 libraries had increased an average of 240%. New educational programs had served over 1,500 people in 3 months. Community satisfaction measured by surveys was dramatically higher than under previous municipal management. The day they received official confirmation the contract would continue, Ilara cried. Not tears of sadness, but of relief mixed with pride. She had faced the biggest challenge of her young professional life and had prevailed, not perfectly, but effectively. That night, Callum took her to the same penthouse where everything had begun 15 months earlier. New Orleans stretched beneath them, the Mississippi River illuminated as always, a constant beacon through all the changes. "Do you remember that New Year's Eve?" he asked, pouring them champagne as he had done then. "Every detail, I was terrified. Of you, of my own feelings, of what it meant to allow myself to be vulnerable." "And now?" Ilara seriously considered the question, looking not just at him but inward, evaluating the transformation she had experienced. "Now I still have fear sometimes, but fear no longer paralyzes me. I can feel it and act anyway. And I think that's the difference between the person I was and the person I've become." Callum raised his glass in a toast, "To the bravest woman I know, not for not having fear, but for acting, despite it." They clinked glasses, the crystalline sound resonating in the space. But it was afterward, when the glasses were empty and they simply stood watching the city, that Callum said something that would change everything again. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what we've built together, both professionally and personally, and there's something I want to ask you." He knelt before her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a simple but beautiful ring, a gold band with a small emerald set, the type of jewel that was elegant without being ostentatious. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I know you're 22, that there are things you want to achieve, experiences you want to have. But I'm asking you to consider a future where we keep building together, where the age difference stops being an obstacle and becomes simply part of our story. Would you consider being my wife, eventually, when the time is right for both of us?" Ilara felt tears running down her cheeks. It was a perfect proposal for them. Not immediate pressure, but promise of future, recognition that she needed more time to grow in her own identity before fully intertwining it with another person. "Yes," she responded, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I would consider that, eventually." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it was perfect, as if it had been made for her. They kissed while New Orleans sparkled beneath them, two people separated by 20 years of experience, but united by something deeper than time: mutual respect, genuine admiration, and the willingness to grow together through any challenge. 18 months after that proposal, on a warm September afternoon when New Orleans was painted in the colors of approaching autumn, Ilara Hayes and Callum Rhodes married in an intimate ceremony at the Audubon Park Clubhouse, the same place where he had first taken her to a gala that had changed her self-perception. It wasn't an ostentatious wedding. Fewer than 50 people attended. Grandmother Willa in the front row with tears of joy streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Callum's mother, who had finally come to respect, if not completely approve of the relationship, the Bridges of Words team, some close friends and representatives from the communities their libraries served. Ilara was 24, Callum was 44. The age difference remained exactly the same, but its meaning had completely transformed. It was no longer a chasm separating them, but simply a fact, as relevant as difference in eye color or height. The dress Ilara chose was simple but elegant, a design by a local designer from the French Quarter who had incorporated traditional Creole lace into a modern cut. She didn't wear a veil but magnolia flowers in her hair, honoring the aroma that had filled so many significant moments of their story together. When the time came for vows, Ilara had insisted they write their own. She didn't want generic words about obedience or traditional roles. She wanted raw truth about what they had built and what they promised to protect. "Callum," she began, her voice clear and firm despite tears shining in her eyes. "When we met almost 3 years ago, I was a broken woman trying to pretend I was whole. I had built walls so high I thought I'd never tear them down. You taught me something fundamental. I didn't need someone to rescue me. I needed someone to believe in me enough to challenge me to rescue myself." She paused, looking at the familiar faces gathered, finally landing back on him. "People have questioned our relationship from the beginning. Too much age difference, they said. Too many differences in class, experience, worldview, and they were right that we're different. But they were wrong about why that matters. Our differences don't weaken us, they complement us. Your patience balances my impulsiveness. My idealism challenges your pragmatism. Together we create something neither of us could have built alone." Her voice softened, becoming more intimate. "I promise you respect, not the blind obedience some traditional ceremonies demand, but real respect that comes from truly seeing another person and valuing their complete humanity. I promise to grow with you, not in perfect synchrony, but in the same direction. I promise challenge when you need to be challenged, support when you need to be supported, and the wisdom to distinguish which is which. And I promise I'll never use your age, neither to elevate you on a pedestal nor to diminish your relevance, but simply as part of the totality of who you are." When she finished, there was reverent silence broken only by the sound of people wiping tears. Callum took her hands, holding them as he had done so many times during the years that had led them to this moment. "Ilara, I'm 44 years old. I've lived long enough to know that true love is rare. Most people spend an entire lifetime without truly experiencing it. I was one of them, building empires of concrete and steel but never building something with true soul, until one rainy afternoon I walked into an archive seeking shelter from a storm and instead found shelter from an empty life." His voice was deep, loaded with emotion he rarely showed publicly. "During these years, you've challenged me in ways no one else dared. You didn't accept my resources without questioning them. You didn't accept my ideas without critically evaluating them. You didn't see me as someone to please, but as someone to collaborate with. And in that process, you taught me that true partnership requires real equality, not declared, but practiced." He looked at the audience briefly before returning to her. "I know there will be those who always question this. They'll say I'm too old for you, that eventually you'll look for someone your own generation, that our age difference is a fundamental crack. But I promise you that I'll never use my age as an excuse to control or to avoid growing. I promise to keep evolving, because real love isn't static. I promise to listen when I'm wrong, and I have enough experience to know I'll be wrong often. His voice broke slightly. "And I promise that every day I'll work to deserve you, not because you're young and I'm old, but because you're extraordinary and I have the privilege of building a life with you." The officiant, a secular celebrant who had been recommended for his progressive approach, smiled with approval before pronouncing them husband and wife. The kiss was long and deep, a celebration not just of that moment, but of the entire journey that had brought them there. Every obstacle overcome, every doubt conquered, every moment where they had chosen to stay and fight instead of flee. The reception was in the Audubon Park Gardens under emerging September stars. There was gumbo prepared by Grandmother Willa's favorite restaurant, mint juleps from a small distillery in the French Quarter, live jazz music that made guests spontaneously rise to dance. During dinner, several guests offered toasts. Grandmother Willa, now 87 and moving more slowly but with mind still sharp, spoke with tremulous but clear voice. "I've seen many things in my life. I've survived hard times, loss of loved ones, wars and peace. And I've learned that true love isn't what they show in movies. It's not perfect or easy. It's two people deciding every day that they're worth the effort. My granddaughter and her husband have differences, yes. And what couple doesn't? The question was never whether they were different, but whether those differences would strengthen or destroy them. And looking at them now, I know the answer." Vivian, Callum's mother, also spoke, her Boston accent thick with emotion. "I won't pretend I understood this relationship from the beginning. I had my doubts, my concerns, but my son has been happier these 3 years than in all his previous adult life, and Ilara has demonstrated a strength of character that few people possess at any age. If this is what true love looks like, then I apologize for doubting. But the most moving moment came from an unexpected source. Margaret, the veteran librarian who had challenged Ilara's authority during the difficult early days of the municipal project, stood with a glass in hand. "I don't know this couple in the personal context," she admitted. "I only know them professionally, but I want to say something about Ilara. When she came to our libraries, I rejected her. She was too young, I thought, too inexperienced. What could someone who had lived so little teach us?" She paused, her eyes finding Ilara's. "But I was wrong. Age doesn't determine wisdom. The willingness to listen, to learn, to grow, that determines wisdom. And this young woman has more of that than many people twice her age. She's transformed not just our libraries, but our lives. And if the man she chose to marry sees that same value in her that we've come to see, then he's a wise man regardless of how many years he has." The applause was thunderous. As the night progressed, Ilara and Callum found themselves alone for a moment in a quiet corner of the garden, away from the celebration's bustle. New Orleans stretched beneath them, the city's lights twinkling like earthbound stars. "What are you thinking?" Callum asked, his arm around her waist. "About all the versions of myself I had to let go to get here. The scared girl who thought love meant control. The young woman who believed her worth came from not needing anyone. The insecure professional who thought youth was a disqualification. Do you miss them? Those earlier versions?" "No. They were necessary to get here, but I don't miss them. This version, the one who can be vulnerable without feeling weak, who can accept help without feeling lesser, who can lead without pretending to have all the answers, this is the version I want to be." Callum kissed her softly on the forehead. "And I had to let go of versions of myself, too. The businessman who measured worth only in financial terms, the man who thought experience made him superior, the loner who had convinced himself that deep connection was impossible. Do you think we could have loved each other if we'd met when I was your age now?" It was a hypothetical but interesting question. Callum considered honestly. "I don't know. Maybe, but we wouldn't have been the people we are now. Time shaped us, both together and separately. The real question isn't whether we could have loved each other in different circumstances, but whether we're grateful for the circumstances that brought us here. Are you? Grateful. Every day." 3 years after that wedding, Bridges of Words operated 12 community libraries throughout Louisiana, serving over 25,000 people monthly. Ilara had been recognized by national library organizations, invited to speak at international conferences, cited in academic research on innovation in community services. But professional recognition wasn't what defined her. What defined her was seeing a single mother in rural Louisiana access training programs that allowed her to get a better job. It was receiving letters from teenagers, thanking for the space where they could explore their interests without judgment. It was watching grandparents learn to use computers for video calls with grandchildren in other cities. Her relationship with Callum had also continued evolving. They hadn't become identical people. They still had disagreements, still navigated perspective differences that sometimes aligned with their generational differences. But they had built tools to manage those conflicts with respect and genuine willingness to find mutually acceptable solutions. On a spring morning 6 years after their first meeting in the archive under the rain, Ilara woke in the apartment they now shared in the warehouse district. She was 27. Callum was 47. Morning light entered through windows, illuminating shelves filled with books they had collected together. Photos of library inaugurations, mementos from trips they had taken during scarce vacations. Callum still slept, his face relaxed in a way he only showed in these private moments. There was more grey in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. She had changed too. She had matured in her expression, a confidence in her posture that hadn't existed years ago. She rose silently, prepared coffee in the small kitchen, and went out to the balcony overlooking the streets. New Orleans was slowly waking, the city that had witnessed all her transformation. She thought of the 21-year-old she had been, so sure that love meant suffering, so convinced that allowing herself to be vulnerable was weakness. She thought of all the obstacles they had faced, social judgments, internal doubts, professional challenges, family resistance. And she thought of what they had built, despite everything. Not just libraries and a successful social enterprise, but a partnership based on genuine respect, mutual admiration, and the willingness to grow together through any storm. Callum appeared in the balcony doorway, 2 coffee mugs in hand, having noticed her absence from bed. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, offering her a mug. "I was thinking." About? About everything. About how we got here. About the woman I was versus the woman I am. About how I almost let fear steal this from me. Callum stood beside her, watching the city wake. Fear never completely disappears. We just learn to live with it, to act despite it. Do you still have fear? About something about us? Sometimes, I fear my age will eventually become a burden rather than a simple difference. I fear not having enough years to see all the dreams we have together come true. But those fears don't paralyze me like they used to. Ilara took his hand, intertwining their fingers. You know what I learned? That true love isn't about eliminating fear or differences. It's about deciding the other person is worth the effort of navigating both. Age, social class, past experiences, all those things create complexity. But complexity isn't weakness. It's richness if we're willing to do the work. And are you willing? She looked at him, seeing not just the 47-year-old man standing beside her, but the man who had walked into an archive under the rain seeking shelter and had found something far more significant. Seeing the partner who had believed in her when she didn't believe in herself, who had respected her need to grow at her own pace, who had been willing to confront his own world for her. "Every day," she responded. "Every day I choose this, choose us, choose the work of building something real in a world that constantly questions its validity." The sun was rising fully now over New Orleans, illuminating the Mississippi River in the distance, bathing the city in golden light. It was a new day like so many others that would come, full of challenges and possibilities in equal measure. And on that balcony, 2 people separated by 20 years of experience but united by something infinitely more powerful than time, stood together looking toward the future they would continue building, one day at a time, with respect, love, and the courage to never let others' definitions dictate their story. Because in the end, they had learned the most fundamental lesson. True love isn't finding someone perfect, or someone exactly like you. It's finding someone who challenges you to become the best version of yourself, someone who respects your growth, even when it's uncomfortable, someone who sees your worth before you see it yourself, and who remains by your side while you do the hard work of believing in that worth. The age difference between Ilara and Callum would always exist, but it had stopped being the main obstacle of their story, to become simply one of many threads woven into the complex and beautiful tapestry of their shared lives. And that, in the end, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. In the central office of Bridges of Words in downtown New Orleans, there was a plaque on the wall that Ilara had placed during the first year. It wasn't a famous quote from some celebrated author or recognized philosopher. It was something Grandmother Willa had said once, during one of those nighttime conversations on the Garden District balcony. True love is not the absence of differences. It is the commitment to navigate those differences with respect, patience, and the faith that together we can create something neither of us could create alone. Those words had guided not just their personal relationship, but the entire philosophy of their work, building bridges between differences, creating spaces where people of different ages, social classes, educational backgrounds could connect through what they shared rather than what separated them. And as New Orleans woke to a new day under the Louisiana sun, as the libraries they had built opened their doors to eager communities, as two people separated by 2 decades chose again to stay and build together. The ancient city whispered its approval through cobblestone streets and hidden courtyards, eternal witness to love stories that defied conventions and emerged stronger precisely because of it.